So as with vision and other senses, hearing is more than simply detecting sounds. What we're trying to do when we hear or listen to things is construct an internal model of the world for what's out there. So in effect, if we have multiple sounds here, so footsteps, guitar, dog barking and so on, essentially what we're trying to do is to segregate that into different meaningful objects, maybe in different locations, and interpreting them. And of course, this is something that our brain does. So if we think about our ear, all it is kind of reflecting sound waves, and the membrane on the cochlea is just kind of bouncing like a drum in effect to the different sounds that are impinging on it. But there's nothing in that signal that is pulling them apart and telling you that one's a dog, one's footprints, and so on. That's something that you're having to infer from the signal. It's not in the signal. So we have to figure out what are the objects out there, where are they, and what do they mean. So in a way, this is very much like the things on vision, that some might be to do with processing location and others the content. And there will be different streams for doing that in the brain, just as we have different streams for knowing where an object is and being able to attend it and knowing what something is. So all sounds are vibrations of air, so pressure changes. It's not even that the molecules are kind of travelling through the air, the molecules are kind of going backwards and forwards. What's travelling through the air is the energy that is kind of being passed from one molecule to another. The key thing in terms of this is that the properties that we hear in sounds reflect properties in the physical parts of the sound waveform. The mapping between them isn't exact. And basically we can think of the waveform of a sound as having two things. So one is a change in pressure over time, and you can plot this by measuring the change in pressure like this, and you get something that looks like a sine wave in effect. So the length of the sine wave is what gives rise to the frequency. So high frequency sounds, the pressure changes very rapidly, and these are perceived as being high pitch, whereas a longer cycle here is a lower frequency, and we would perceive those as being lower pitch. So this kind of length here, this is related to the frequency, and this corresponds approximately to the pitch. The actual size of the pressure changes, so whether or not the maximum pressure change is large or not, depends on, always related to the loudness. So again, this is like an intensity measure as to how much they're changing, or how much pressure changes. But remember, the pressure, because it's the sound waves are oscillating backwards and forwards, it will go to zero, and negative pressure just means it's going in the other direction. That's all it means here in terms of what's happening. So this is the simplest example of a sound, is a single change like this. But typically what you have in something like speech or even with music is that you might have multiple sounds that come out of, say, a person's mouth or an instrument and so on. So it's not the case that each of these sounds is from a separate speaker or separate source. Is that my mouth is producing lots of, it's producing one sound, but the sound can be imagined as being decomposed into lots of simpler sounds, is the right way of thinking about it. So a complex sound, such as speech, can be decomposed into these different kind of simple waves, in effect. That's the right way of thinking about this. And here you can kind of plot these as these bands here. So you've got three different frequencies that are constant over time. And natural sounds are more like this, although these would vary over time rather than just being flat lines. Okay. So how do we get these kinds of information into the brain? Well, there are actually more synapses going from the ear to the auditory cortex than there are from the eye to the visual cortex. So audition is already a lot more elaborated by the time we get to the higher levels of the brain, the primary auditory cortex, than vision. And again, just to kind of reassure you for the multiple choice test, I'm not going to expect you to be able to label and get all of these things here. If I say one of these regions over and over again, it's probably something that you might get asked about, but in general, I'm not expecting this kind of level of knowledge. The key thing here really is to note that these kinds of the processing that goes from the ear to the auditory cortex isn't just a chain reaction of sending the same information upwards. It is actually doing things to that information, and I won't go into all the kind of early stages of information coding. And the other thing to say is that the directions actually go backwards as well as forwards. So it's not just that information is being carried from the ear to the brain. Actually, there is information that goes from the brain to the ear. And in fact, there are more connections going from the brain to the ear, which is, for some people, kind of puzzling. Obviously, this is presumably related to attentional mechanisms to do with, allowing some signals through at the preference from others. But actually, these early kinds of downwards gating mechanisms are not as well understood as you might imagine. What's called the primary auditory cortex is called that because that is the first part of the cortex that receives information from the ear. So all these other way stations here are in the subcortex, and you've got something called the primary auditory cortex here. And this is made up of a set of regions, a little bit like a Russian doll, in which you've got things called the core, the belt, and the parabelt that are kind of dealing with increasingly complex auditory information. A good way of thinking about sounds is to kind of utilise some of your knowledge about how vision works and say actually there are parallel systems in sounds, but actually hearing doesn't work exactly the same. There are some differences. But basically one of the things that they have in common is that both hearing and vision involve these kind of nucleus. So the lateral geniculate nucleus and the medial geniculate nucleus are involved in vision and sound. Here, so you've got these similar way stations. There are then these differences. So whereas your visual system is what's called retinotopically organised, and what that means is that different points on the retina map to equivalent points on the cortex. So it's kind of like having a spatial map of vision on there. In hearing, you don't have kind of spatial maps. What you have are maps of frequency. So they're called tonotopic, so like tones. You could think of it almost as your auditory cortex kind of having little kind of piano keyboards where high frequency to low frequency kind of arrange so that sounds are ordered by how they sound in terms of pitch rather than where they are in space. So you've got these different principles there. And this reflects the early processing stemming from the cochlea or the retina. Also, your visual system is very good at spatial information, detecting where things are, and we talked about how vision drives certain illusions, such as the rubber hand illusion, and this is because the spatial information from vision is very accurate. But the auditory system has its own kind of speciality, and this is temporal processing. So by temporal, I mean time, not the temporal lobes. So getting things in time. So if you so things like Morse code, ... you're actually very good at hearing that. But if I present you flashes like this, you're poor at detecting those in vision. But you're very good at picking up trains of dots and dashes and so on. And obviously this is important for things like speech, where the sound wave is changing very rapidly over time. With vision, of course, things do move and they do change, but that's to some extent the exception rather than the norm. Whereas in vision, there are these well-documented specialities in early processing, for instance, to do with colour and movement and to some extent shape. This is less well-documented in the auditory domain. There is some evidence of regions that respond more to pitch than other things, and I'll mention that there are regions that respond more to what a sound is versus where a sound is. But you don't have this relatively fine granularity in terms of different auditory features that you get. And another similarity is that you do have these major branches depending on whether the information is to do with what on the one hand, so figuring out what somebody's saying, what a piece of music is, versus where or how the sound source is coming from or what is generating it. So if we delve into the kind of early auditory region, so the primary auditory cortex and surrounding areas, again you can see that this is the kind of tonotopic organisation, that you've got low frequency information and then you've got high frequency information. You can imagine that as being like a piano keyboard, but actually you've got another one this way, so you've got multiple kind of representations of certain frequencies in here. And this kind of reflects the properties of the nerves that are feeding sound information upwards here. So what that means is that if I were to stick an electrode in here and see which sounds this neuron responds to, it's going to respond to sounds of about 300 hertz, whereas if I stick an electrode in here and see what sounds it responds to, it will respond to sounds of, say, 3,000 hertz. So you've got this kind of tuning. There aren't these sharp divisions, obviously. This is just drawn on stylistically. And then around that, you've got these other regions that respond kind of to combinations of individual sounds, is how you would describe it. But if you were to kind of put an electrode into these early auditory regions and find out what neurons are responding to, again, you get neurons that respond to one pitch and not another, but also you get neurons that respond to other aspects of the sound as well, so to certain loudness properties, tempo, so to the rhythmic changes, so whether it's a fast or a slow rhythm, and timbre is the quality of sound. I'll talk about this, but we can think about that as being, say, the difference between a trumpet and a violin, something like this, when they're of the same pitch, that you can figure out how they relate to that. What you also find is that neurons in the early parts of the auditory cortex, the core region, tend to respond to pure tones, so sounds of a single frequency, whereas neurons, as you kind of go outside of this core region, respond to combinations of frequencies. And what we could think about this is in terms of a hierarchical processing, that there are some neurons that kind of tune into multiple neurons and kind of almost group the output of multiple neurons together in the same way as we saw for simple cells in vision, which group kind of these pixel-like on-off circular receptive fields into straight lines by placing them all kind of in a row, if you will. So, for instance, what you might have in the early region is one neuron that responds to 200 hertz, one neuron that responds to 240 hertz, and so on. Whereas in the other region, what you might have is a neuron that responds to a range of frequencies. So it responds to a range of sounds between 200 and 400 hertz. But what you could imagine computationally that this neuron is doing is that it's simply just receiving inputs from each of these neurons here. So it's receiving inputs from a band of neurons and just being fired whenever one of those goes in. So you can imagine it as being, if you know electronics, a bit like an OR gate. It's looking if there's activity in any of those neurons and then generating an action potential if they do. What you might also have is ones that change, that respond to changes in frequency. So you might have a neuron that responds, for instance, to a sound of 200 hertz followed by a sound of, say, 240 hertz. And what you've got here are kind of sweeps in pitch that are tuning into those sorts of things. And it will respond to neurons kind of firing in succession. So in effect, its receptive field might respond when this neuron fires, followed by that neuron in that particular sequence. And obviously some neurons might respond to downward glides and upward glides in frequency. But you can imagine how you can build from these kinds of properties into more kind of complex sound patterns. You also get these other kinds of properties as well. So remember when we talked about neurons in the visual cortex that they have these on-off properties. And what that means is that they respond to light in the centre of the receptive field, but don't respond to light around it. They respond when the light is switched off in the surround. Now, obviously, auditory neurons don't respond to light, they respond to sound. But you get the same principle. So what you might have is a neuron that responds to sounds in the 200 to 300 hertz range when that sound is on, but then it will respond to an off sound in the surrounding frequency range. So if you switch off a sound of 300 hertz, then the neuron fires. So it's almost as if it's tuning to its preferred frequencies and trying to tune out kind of adjacent frequencies with it. It's almost creating an edge, if you will. That's the right way of thinking about it. But the edge here is in terms of sounds rather than in terms of spatial edges that you would have. So these are examples of recordings from two different neurons that show the kind of the spatial pattern here. So again, you would have hemispheric specialization, that the Left auditory cortex tends to respond more to right sounds, the right to left, but here you don't have as sharp a cut-off in vision. So the neurons do receive information from both ears and both hemispheres, but they still have a preference. So this neuron here, the darker areas, means that it's would respond to sounds coming from, say, 30 degrees to 90 degrees to the opposite side. So contralateral means the opposite side. So assuming this is a left auditory cortex neuron, it's responding to sounds in this region of space, and it responds preferentially to sounds of 30 to 80 decibels. That's just the dark here. So it can respond to loudness and space as well as to frequency. Here, frequency or pitch isn't represented. Here you've got a neuron that responds more focally. So here, ipsilateral means it's coming from the same side. So imagine you're recording from your left auditory cortex. It's responding to, say, sounds that are coming from the left in this part of space here, and to sounds of a particular loudness, so between 30 and 50 decibels. It's not necessarily responding maximally to the loudest sounds. It's tuning into mid-range loudness in this case. And obviously, you could imagine that all the neurons are tuning into different things, and the sum of those will if you look over the pattern of all those neurons, you can figure out where things are, their relative loudness, and so on. As you move away from these regions here, what you also get is a difference between where and what. So where goes more into your parietal lobes, and what is kind of going down to the temporal lobes, down this way. And this is kind of mirroring what you have for vision, where vision is starting here. So basically, these more anterior regions going to the temporal lobes are interested, for instance, in what the sounds are. So again, a lot of this comes from, say, primates putting an electrode into their brain, also mice and so on. And these will respond to, say, different sound patterns, but they care less about where the sound is coming from, whether it's coming from up, down, left or right. But they care whether it's a kind of a high-pitched squeak or a low-pitched grunt. And so these neurons are interested in the content of the sound. What you would then have is another branch coming out of the auditory cortex going posterior into the parietal lobes that responds to where a sound is. So here, it might not care whether the sound is an oo or an ah, but it will care whether the sound is coming from up here or down there. So the neurons are kind of tuning in to where the sound is and less interested in what the sound is. To locate sounds in space, basically what you're having to do is to compare information from the two different ears, in effect. So neurons that are responding to the information carried upwards from the ears. And there are a number of ways of doing that. One is that you simply compare the loudness between the two ears. So if a sound is coming from the left, it will be marginally louder in your left ear than your right ear, and this will give you a clue as to where it is in space. The other one is what's called a time difference. So if a sound is coming from the left, it will hit your left ear before it hits your right ear. And again, whether or not you rely more on time or loudness partly depends on whether the sound is high frequency or low frequency, and so on. But all this, the difference between the left and the right ear is only helpful for locating things in space on the left-right plane. It's not helpful for locating the elevation of sounds, the upwards, downwards. The way that you can do that is by figuring out the kind of, well, you could call them echoes. They're actually reflections from the ear. So the ear being the outer ear, your pinna, these things here which you think don't have any function, and your ear canal where the sound waves in effect ricochet here. And what you kind of do is that your brain has a model of how sounds get distorted by the shape of your head and your ears. And that model is specific, or relatively specific, to the shape of your ears. And what it in effect does is that a sound coming from above will reflect off your ears in a different way from a sound coming from below. And your brain can figure out from the pattern of reflections in the ear where it is coming from based on its prior knowledge of how sounds reflect in your ear. The way that they tested this is that you can take models of a person's ear, for instance. So if you were to take a plaster cast of my ear and you put kind of microphones in them so they record how the sound waves get distorted, you could show that the sound waves behave in a particular way. And then if you play those sound waves into my ear canal, so they're not literally reflecting in my ear, it will help me to be able to locate sounds. Whereas if I take a model of your ears and do the same thing, I will still be able to do it above chance, but not as good as I can with if the sounds are being recorded from a model of my own ears, for instance. So, and that's simply because everybody's ears are similar, but everybody's ears are unique. So to some extent you can generalise, but it will be much better if you use your own ears for doing that sort of thing. And this is the basic idea. It's actually called head-related transfer function, but again, that's not a term that you would have to memorise. But the idea is that you take a sound pattern here, so this is time, and this is the frequencies of the sound, where the colours represent the different energies. And basically the left and the right here will kind of act as a filter of those sounds, and one ear will accentuate some frequencies above another, but also the shape of your head will distort the sound pattern because of the way that they reflect around. But the idea is that within your brain, kind of going from the auditory cortex into the parietal lobes, just outside of the auditory cortex, there's a brain region that is involved in computing this, that takes this kind of spatial information and takes knowledge of how your head distorts sounds and tries to figure out where this is coming from. This is the region here called the plano temporale. And so basically in these ascending auditory pathways, the two ears are already being compared from the cochlea to the primary auditory cortex. The information from the two ears are already being compared, which is why your left auditory cortex can respond to some left sounds as well as right sounds. Okay, any questions about the basic sounds before I come to music?
How do you focus on a specific sound if, like, there's two sounds that are similar but then come from the same area? Like,
yeah. So that's a good question. So people have looked at this. So the classic kind of example of this is called the cocktail party phenomenon, where you've got multiple people speaking and you're trying to listen to one. So this is seen as kind of an attention example rather than a perception example, but obviously it's the same thing because you've got multiple kind of channels here. And what you find is that if you think about the kind of the what and the where streams, that you kind of tune into one line of information above another. So you can either do it by, for instance, tuning into what a person's voice is like, so they're a high-pitched speaker, and in which case what you're doing there is that you're attending more to the what stream, or you could do it with location, and you're attending more to the where stream. So you can, in effect, accentuate one information above another. But it will depend on whether you're tuning into a speaker or whether you're tuning into where the speaker is. And in effect, the neurons will get amplified in the brain depending on what information you're using to solve that problem. But yeah, so people have looked at that in terms of how you kind of solve the cocktail party problem. The other thing that you would obviously do in the real world is use vision, and that's using vision of people's lips and things like that in order to sync the hearing. And that is more of the kind of more parietal kind of multisensory regions that we talked about last time that do that. So music is obviously relying on a lot of these basic mechanisms. So music has to rely on the ears and all of these pathways because you're not going to develop special systems for that. But the idea is that over and above these kind of basic mechanisms for processing sounds, music might have a particular neural basis. But this is quite puzzling because nobody quite knows why music exists in the first place. It's much easier to come up with solutions for why speech and language exist. So Steven Pinker, for instance, has been quite dismissive of music, kind of calling it auditory cheesecake. What he means by that is that it doesn't really serve a purpose. It's just something that our auditory systems like. It's kind of like big tickled. So for him, the music is kind of almost something you get for free, having kind of evolved language, if you will. For other people, they regard music as kind of being a precursor to language, being able to produce vocalizations that, for instance, would communicate emotion, location, grabbing attention, and so on. That this is like a proto-language in effect. See, attracting mates and so on. This is the sort of thing that other species do. So it's a bit of a puzzle as to why the music exists, but it's often seen as being universal in the sense that it emerges without training. Now here I'm talking about things like drumming, kind of following tempo, singing, and so on, where you don't need to be trained and you don't need to develop complex musical instruments and so on, and that's what I mean about it being universal. Now there are some people who struggle with music to either perceive it or understand it or even to enjoy it, and we'll talk a little bit about that. How music does differ from other sounds is that in effect what you're doing is, if you imagine a kind of a continuous range of sounds or frequencies, you're kind of passing them into what are discrete chunks. And you can think about that in terms of the keys on a musical keyboard, is that here you've got, for instance, A, B, C, D, E, and so on. But there will actually be a sound that is somewhere between A and B, and not just B flat, somewhere that's in between that as well. So it's as if you're kind of creating a discrete or symbol-like system or categories within a continuous range of sounds, and how those get combined is effectively what gives you melody and gives you other aspects of music that make it distinctive relative to other aspects of sound. And again, the idea is that there are certain things in music that probably depend on biology and how sounds are perceived. So I appreciate not everyone's musical, but if you think about an octave, these are two sounds that we would call, say, C and C, that are in different pitches. But in terms of the physics of sound, they're exactly double in terms of frequency. So it might be 2,000 hertz and 4,000 hertz. And we just happen to call them an octave. But other cultures might call them other things. But the point is, there's something special about this ratio of 2 to 1. And what's special is that the sounds don't clash. And they don't clash because the two different waveforms become synchronous if you kind of plot them. They kind of coalesce. They create a meaningful thing. So again, musical systems, although our cultures play around with these things, it's partly to do with how sounds are combined and the biology of how we perceive those things. And that's why an octave sounds nice, and that's why other cultures have things like octaves, even if they don't call them that, or they don't divide them into 8 parts. So it reminds me a little bit of Prognose, if you know much about that. So these are people who can't tell faces apart, but they can see that a face is a face. It's just all faces look the same. But again, Prognose can tell whether somebody's happy and sad, and so on. So obviously it kind of suggests that there isn't just a module in the brain that you want to label music and then put a cross through, and so on. So clearly she's able to process some aspects of music in order to get, for instance, whether it's happy and sad. And so on, and she can pass certain aspects of perception, so she's not deaf in a conventional sense. So Isabelle Perret, who was the French-Canadian lady on the videos, developed this kind of model of music processing that in effect decomposes music into multiple elements. And essentially what you've got is an early processing of sounds, which is all the kinds of stuff I've talked about so far. And then you've got this kind of branch of 3 different processors, if you will. So this is separate to the what versus where. It's kind of all kind of subdivisions within music, I suppose, is one way of thinking about it, but not necessarily specific to music. One is dealing with what's called pitch organisation. So this is kind of melodies. God, I wish I could sing, but you know this sort of thing here. The up and down, and that's the contours of the music. One is what's called temporal organisation. Basically, this is rhythm. So how fast and slow, where the beat is, and so on, irrespective of the kind of the pitch contours. And the third one here, which isn't really music, is speech. So the idea is that when I listen to somebody singing Happy Birthday, my brain is effectively parting that into at least 3 different streams. The words are going down one route, the pitch is going, the pitch melody is going into another kind of set of routines, and the tempo, how fast or slow, where the beat is, and so on, is being processed by another module, if you will. So in a way, these are kind of more perceptual, high-level perceptual modules involved in what was called pitch organisation and temporal organisation. Here, I won't go into all these. These are just, again, hierarchical, whether it's just the difference between 2 notes or a phrase and so on. And then over and above that, you've got a set of more, again, more higher order knowledge of music, which would be things like getting the expression from music. So versus the musical lexicon. So that would be, in effect, a store of familiar tunes. So I don't know what the conclusion of the lady there is, but my guess is it's something around getting to this kind of store of the musical lexicon from here. But you can still tell whether something's happy or sad from whether it's a slow or a fast beat, for instance. So there would be information going into that, either from her ability to perceive rhythm or changes in pitch. So again, low pitch is typically sad, minor music as opposed to major, and so that would be a kind of a pitch-based one. So what is the evidence for this? So again, there are case studies of people who seem to have lost their memory for tunes, but in other respects they can hear normally. So it's as if they've lost their knowledge of the musical world rather than their perception of it. So it's a little bit of a distinction between perceptual aspects of this. You can think of amusia as a kind of agnosia, by the way. It's a kind of an auditory agnosia. So this patient here had problems in recognising familiar tunes. Again, relatively minor pitch perception problems, but they argued that could account for it. But interestingly, was good at identifying speech. So intonation would be whether or not you're asking a question. So when you ask a question, your pitch kind of rises at the end. If you're Australian, everything's a question. Everything goes up at the end as well. So really ultra confusing. If you look at people with dementia who obviously have memory problems, it doesn't seem to go with problems in episodic memory. So Alzheimer's patients, for instance, have problems in remembering, as you know, what happened yesterday. So, but they tend to have good memory for tunes, and this is partly that a lot of tunes are kind of also learnt in childhood. What you find is patients who lose their knowledge of the world, so semantic dementia, so the patients who can't tell, say, a cow from a dog, or a chicken from a robin or whatever, that this kind of knowledge structure does impair your ability to remember tunes. So it seems to be part of our semantic system, semantic memory, rather than episodic memory, is where musical knowledge is stored, such as that. In terms of rhythm, well, again, so one idea about music perception is that it's a predominantly right hemisphere function, and that's probably true for pitch, but the evidence is that rhythm is, if anything, a more left hemisphere system. So you've got a division potentially in this kind of model with rhythm-based things being more left hemisphere, pitch-based things being more right hemisphere, but it's not, it's relative rather than absolute. And this comes from neuropsychology, that basically that being able to judge timing. So here it's things like same, different judgments. You go versus whether those are the same or different, and you can vary how you do it. So here it's exactly the same pitch information, and you're just varying whether or not the sequence is the same. This would be more affected by left hemisphere lesions than right hemisphere lesions. There's also, this is a family who have problems, it was kind of a genetic problem in speech, that they have problems in speech, but they also have problems in certain aspects of music. And they have a particular problem in rhythm perception and production. So rhythm production would be that I tap a beat and you have to tap it back, for instance, that they have problems with that. In terms of kind of more brain imaging, basically rhythm processing isn't just an auditory skill. So when you're listening to a rhythm, you're also activating your motor cortex. So again, this suggests that there's a strong link or coupling between listening to a sound and I suppose a bit like simulating or trying to reproduce it. So even though you're not actually physically tapping it, it's almost if your motor cortex is producing something like a tapping beat. So again, listening to a regular versus irregular rhythm will start to activate your motor cortex. It's like a preparation. It's why people dance and things like this, is that your motor system becomes kind of trained to rhythms and beats. And presumably people who aren't very good at dancing also have problems in perception of rhythm, but I don't know if that's ever been shown. Also, finding a beat might be the motor cortex. Your basal ganglia, which is kind of involved in, these kind of systems are impaired in Parkinson's disease and so on. That this is important for maintaining a beat, so keeping a beat alive kind of over time rather than finding a beat. So again, the rhythm isn't just an auditory process, it's an auditory kind of motor process, even when you're not explicitly asked to tap or dance or anything else with that. With regards to pitch and melody, there's a particular type of amusia that some people are born with, which was traditionally called tone deafness, but is now often referred to as congenital amusia. Basically, these are people who don't get much enjoyment out of music. They probably would not own a Spotify account. It might be kind of 1 or 2% of the population who would have this. And again, they report that music doesn't sound nice or it all sounds the same, would be their kind of thing. But again, you wouldn't know who had this. They will be there amongst the undergraduate population and so on. Basically, what's been shown in terms of their behavioural pattern is that they are good at rhythm. That they, in this study, they describe them as out of tune but not out of time. So these people can tap back a rhythm. They can decide whether two beats are the same or different. When you do that, they can pass those tests. But instead, if you play them two different melodies, so da 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 da, or so da 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 da, they would be find it difficult to say whether those were the same or different. They struggle to follow those. And they don't seem to have particular problems in perceiving individual pitch, so it seems to be around perceiving the relative relationship between different pitch. What's also interesting is that they have differences in their grey matter density. This is a method called voxel-based morphometry, where basically you just look at each different voxel of the brain and you compute how much grey matter is in that. So people with amusia actually have more grey matter in certain parts of the brain, which is puzzling because you intuitively imagine that more grey matter means that you're better at something, and there are examples in which that's the case. You could also imagine that during development you get rid of certain neurons which aren't helping. They might just be adding kind of neural noise. They might be disrupting rather than tuning into things. So we don't quite know. This is a puzzling example as to why people who are bad or something have more grey matter in parts of their brain. But they have it, again, more in their right hemisphere than their left hemisphere. So again, this suggests that the left hemisphere is partly specialised for rhythm, the right hemisphere more for melody. And it's in both high-level auditory cortex and the superior temporal gyrus. The auditory cortex is kind of around here, maybe just behind it in that. So auditory related regions. Here, this is a frontal region that's kind of the right hemisphere equivalent of Broca's area. So Broca's area is important for certain aspects of language, but here it's normally on the left hemisphere. So again, we don't quite know the explanation of this, but it is out there. What's also kind of puzzling is that, again, coming back to the idea that nobody really understands why music is there. So are these people actually, if you were to give them more subtle tests of speech, would they also have problems in non-musical areas? So again, people with congenital amusia don't come across as having overt problems in speech. But actually, the idea is that speech is rather different from music. So in order to process speech, you kind of have to understand what I'm saying, but you don't have to understand whether I say it in a sing-song way or whether I say it in a flat way or whatever. The content of my speech is the same, irrespective of whether I say it in kind of a musical way or not musical way. So the actual function of speech is very different from what you're trying to do when you listen to or enjoy music, where you're trying to extract other kinds of information that's more contour information. But there are some aspects of speech in which the musical aspects of speech are important. So again, intonation and prosody. So these are things like whether you're questioning or whether you're making a statement. And what you find is that actually when you give people with tone deafness these kinds of tests, asking them whether somebody's asking a question or making a statement, they struggle with that. So they struggle to kind of interpret the pitch contours in speech. It's just that those contours aren't normally helpful for understanding speech, except in these kind of more pragmatic contexts. The other way in which musicality comes into music is in tonal languages. So tonal languages are particularly common in, well, East Asia, as far as I know. I don't know whether they have them in Africa. I'll talk about some African languages in a bit. But basically what it is that if I say cup, 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 all you hear is the word cup, and yes, you can hear the fact that I've said it in 3 different ways, but I'm referring to one single thing, okay? Whereas if you would speak Chinese or something, each of those different examples of saying cup might mean different things. So this is ma, said in
ma, 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 ma.
Are there any Chinese speakers here? But you have to trust me that this, I don't know whether this is in the order here, but each one of those ma's mean different things. It means mum, nub, horse, and scold, in I'm not sure which order. But to us, it's all ma.
Ma, 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 ma.
So if you were a congenital amusic person and you happen to be a Chinese speaker, would you have problems in language? And the answer is yes. So you can still function in daily life, but you will get those mixed up. It might be very subtle in daily life, and the reason for that is that if I'm talking about stables and things like that, you will probably guess I'm not talking about my mum, that I'm talking about a horse. Okay, so the context will fill in the clues, so you can compensate a lot for these particular problems. But it doesn't mean that the problems are not there; they are there in these people. So again, it's as if some skills kind of load very heavily on music, but they're not specific to music. They're used to some extent in other particular contexts. And so music appears to be the main symptom, and that's because music requires this kind of fine-grained analysis, at least when you give people tests such as discriminating between 2 musical phrases. And speech tends not to operate like that. What about timbre and emotion? So timbre is basically being able to discriminate between different instruments, so things like trumpet, violin, and so on, irrespective of being able to discriminate pitch. And again, the right temporal lobe seems to be important for that. So timbre might be a particular element of when these things change, it's about how the pitch changes in terms of sweeps and things like that. So it might sort of rely on particular aspects of frequency information. But there's some evidence that patients can be relatively impaired. What about emotion? So if we think back to her model, that here you've got a separate kind of module for recognizing emotions. So people with congenital amusia, for instance, are generally good at recognizing emotions. If you play emotional music, then you activate parts of the brain involved in emotions, such as your amygdala, for instance. But the question is, what makes music emotional? Who gets to decide that that music is scary and that music is happy? Is it something that our parents teach us, or is it something that we kind of get? And the evidence is that basically that there are certain emotional motifs which are seen as being similar across cultures. So again, these are studies that have looked at kind of hunter-gatherers in the tribe that the study I'm thinking of was done in Africa, where basically they played Western music. So Jaws is the what I'm kind of implying here. So there's something about fear that's quite staccato, and the way that the music changes. So again, people who've never heard the Jaws music before will recognise that as scary music. Okay. Or they would recognise the particular rhythmic pattern that goes into scary music. Things like music that's written in major mode as opposed to minor mode is kind of happy, sad. And again, this is quite cross-culturally universal, including for people who've not been exposed to Western music. As is things like tempo. So tempo would be happy music is faster and sad music is slower. Things like that. So basically, you can get those kinds of knowledge here, but the idea is that it activates the emotional parts of the brain. It's not listening to scary music and deciding it's scary is not just an auditory problem, it's an emotional one. And people who have damage to their amygdala, who have problems primarily in emotion, cannot recognise scary music, but they still have intact auditory perception. Okay. So it suggests that hearing is not just something that's done in the hearing system. It kind of involves a coordination of networks involved in, well, in this case, in emotion, in terms of spatial attention, in terms of all these other sorts of mechanisms that we're talking about. And this brings us to what is special about music and whether other species might have some of it. So again, there are various theories that music is something that is linked to emotion. It's something that is related, again, to particular speech patterns. So the idea is that even with something like piano music and so on, that they are, people have made the claim that they are following the way that our auditory system responds to speech in terms of how sounds are organised and so on. To read those papers, you do actually have a fairly good understanding of music and so on. But this is the claim that's been made by people like Purvis, who argues that our kind of cultural construction of music has been very much constrained by the parameters of how we speak, that we speak within a certain range and so on. So the question is, how do other animals kind of deal with music? So studies that have been done with primates, so here the study that we are looking at here was done on tamarins, who are, I think that they live in the Americas, but anyway, they're very distant relations to us. They're not like chimpanzees and stuff like that. They're millions of years since we shared a common ancestor. If you play tamarins human music, they don't like it. Basically, if you give them preference studies, they tend to prefer silence over any kind of human-based music. Whereas humans, including human infants and so on, will often orient towards human music over silence.
Okay. So for the last 20 minutes or so, I'll talk a little bit about recognising speech and then in the next lecture we talk a lot more about how we understand speech and process language and sentences and so on. Basically the problem with recognising speech is, well, there's a whole lot of issues with it, but this is a spectrogram here of a sentence. Joe took father's shoe bench out. So here you've got time going across the axis here. coming out towards you, if you will, in the dark bands would be kind of energy. So up here you've got frequency. So this is a band of kind of energy there. So vowels have this kind of structure of multiple kinds of frequencies as the air resonates in there. What you then have is kind of gaps in the airflow. The gaps in the airflow have nothing to do with the gaps that are in written language. The gaps in spoken speech are to do with closing your mouth and releasing air. So when silence is when your articulators are closed, and then when you speak, release them, they come out. And that can happen mid-word, at the end of the word, at the beginning of words, and so on. So in a way, one of the challenges is to find where the word boundaries are, where one word ends and the next one begins, because it is not there, obviously, in the spectrogram. So here you're having to use your top-down knowledge, and that is something we'll talk about next time. The other issue here is around some of the things I talked about, is that recognising speech as opposed to kind of a lot of what we're talking about in music is that you're trying to understand the content of speech. So, I can get everybody in the room to pronounce this and they will all be acoustically different. And to some extent, the task of language recognition is to throw away all that auditory variance and to pick out the commonalities with it. So here we're primarily interested in knowing what the content of speech is and not whether or not you've got a husky voice or a high-pitched voice and so on. That's interesting at one level to know who the speaker is and so on, but to actually understand speech, it's not necessarily relevant. And again, the idea is that speech also has these kind of what versus, it's called the how root for speech. But this is our auditory cortex here. But basically, as you go forward, the what root is concerned with not just where things are, but it's concerned with with what is changing in the speech. So the content of speech. So before I talked about a how root that goes to a where root. This is deciding where one speaker is and so on. This root also has a kind of a motor branch, and the motor branch is in effect to figure out what it is that somebody's saying, to almost like repeat it back, to kind of echo the speech. And that this would go kind of from the parietal lobes into the frontal lobes where the motor representations are as well. So here, this is the kind of the what root, understanding what people are saying, and this is the how root, which is in effect an adaptation of the where root, but it's mapping onto motor syllables here and not just where speakers are. And you could also imagine that there would be a who root, so knowing who is speaking, for instance, being able to recognise somebody's accent or that husky voice is such and such a person. And that's also kind of part of this stream here, the what stream, if you will. It's an adaptation of that stream. So again, although we talk about these two branches, there would be multiple aspects of it depending on exactly what it is that you're tuning into. But most language, you're trying to understand what somebody is saying. So, and of course, human speech depends on exactly the same kind of early auditory processing that we talked about for regular sounds and for music and so on. So the question really is, at what point does speech become different from any other sounds? And typically, this is outside of your primary auditory cortex, which responds equally for speech, music, and made-up sounds. It's only as you go to higher levels in auditory processing that you get a tuning in to speech-like patterns. And again, it doesn't become strongly left lateralized until quite late in that process, maybe even to the point at which you are saying speech. So it might just be the production of speech that's left lateralized, and hearing speech is a bit of both. The idea here is that the what root in the early process is that it's responding to changes in the speech signal. In a way, it's kind of tracking all these kind of ups and downs of these contours here. And it does so on different timescales. So you would have some neurons that respond to very fast changes in the speech signal, others that respond to medium, and others to slower. And the idea is that these neurons are kind of partly hierarchically organized. So earlier regions respond to fast changes, and then others respond to somewhat slower changes, and so on. And that this will correspond roughly to different parts of speech. So a phoneme is like a r, a l, a t. So the individual sounds of speech are a bit like the letters of language, the kind of the smallest unit of speech. Whereas a syllable is a group of phonemes, so cat, bat, rat, and so these are all one-syllable words. And then stress patterns would be the more kind of longer, slower musical contours about how, whether it's monotone, whether it's how it's changing, and so on. And one suggestion is, again, that this is somewhat hierarchically organised, so as you come out of the primary auditory cortex, initially it responds more to phoneme-like fast changes, then syllable-like medium changes, and so on. So it's building up from slow to fast. And one suggestion is that what's effectively happening in the auditory cortex at kind of multiple scales is that you are, to some extent, entraining neurons to the rhythm of speech. So if this is the speech waveform here, so this is plotted not as a spectrogram, just in terms of the amount of kind of energy, you can see that although it's not fully regular, that basically there is a rhythmic structure to speech, that the syllables kind of come at a certain rate, and so on, depending on how the speaker is. And the idea is that what's happening is that this kind of speech waveform is being processed here in the early auditory cortex, the primary auditory cortex, but then in other kind of levels of the hierarchy, what you have is that you have neurons that start to track these kind of rhythmic properties. What does it mean for a neuron to track the rhythmic property? Is that it starts to fire in sync with my syllables. So as I'm speaking to you now, there will be neurons in your secondary auditory cortex that are firing in sync to my speech rhythm. And if I slow it down, your neurons will do the same. So in effect, it's picking up the rhythms, but again at slower time courses. So here, this is a more syllable level of change, and here these kind of rapid changes are more phoneme level. And the idea here is that these then feed back in order to predict what to expect in the signal. So you've got this kind of recursive pattern that these neurons are kind of firing in the rhythm of speech, and that they are then being used to predict it. So in effect, this is the raw input, and then this is a kind of a modified input based on predicting where the dark bits are going to be, when it is that I'm going to have the most energy in my speech here. So you're using this kind of knowledge of the rhythm of a speaker in order to predict and anticipate when syllables are going to appear. And that's how you come, one of the ways in which you start to solve the segmenting problem is that you're not just waiting for the input to happen, you are actively predicting what the input is and where the likely edges and boundaries are by getting neurons to fire at certain rates alongside the speech signal. Okay. And you can record this in EEG. So remember, EEG is very sensitive to timing. It's got good temporal resolution. So fMRI is quite slow and sluggish. But with EEG, you can literally put the recordings on there, and because the speech stream changes very rapidly, you can measure the electrical activity as you're listening to speech and show that your neurons are actually firing in sync with the speech stream that you're listening to. So EEG is the measure that tends to be used for this. And again, this is because sounds are very rapidly changing in the temporal domain. So this is the early processing of the what route, is that you've got these kind of rhythmic structure that is being captured in the firing of neurons that helps to code syllable and phonemic boundaries. The idea behind the how route, as it says, is that this is important for repeating speech. So if I say something and you have to repeat it back verbatim, the idea here is that you have a kind of a working memory system that you then have to repeat back. And you can repeat things back that don't make any sense. I can give you nonsense syllables that you can then repeat back. So the idea here is that this is kind of an auditory to motor route that is different from actually understanding speech. So the how root obviously can be used for both repeating back meaningful and meaningless speech. And the idea here is that it's involved in linking sound to motor representations, to some extent visual representations. So things like when I'm speaking and you're seeing my lips move, you would use this how root there to link together the movements of my mouth with the auditory stream in order to figure out what's happening. And there's a whole, one early idea is that basically we recognize speech by linking it to motor representations. So one way in which we kind of solve speech constancy, so the idea that we all, we all say a word, they've all got different acoustic properties, is that the motor aspects of speech are the things that are constant. These are the things that you can activate irrespective of the auditory input. It helps to do that. I'll come back to the McGurk illusion. But the idea here is that, that the how root is also particularly left lateralized. So there are some languages which have completely different phonemes from us. And this is a click language that's spoken in certain African dialects where they have, like, I can't even make them, you'll have a listen. Ah, it's not there. Then I can go to. So things like popping and that kind of sound, which for us we can hear it, but it's not part of our repertoire. And for these people, they would activate this this kind of how root, whereas for us, it's not part of our speech system. So it's not a left lateralized how root. We would use a different system for doing it. So it's kind of a little bit like an expertise. See what I can get these girls to speak in. This is the language called Kosa. Oh.
Ơi đã út bụi cha út phô bồn đốn ngủ sổ đuôi cô bá ai thấy về loạn là mẹ ai thà cô gọi thì sao cha cũng bền luôn. Thank you.
So these kind of pops and click sounds are part of their particular language, and if people listen to that and it's not part of their routine, they would have a completely different system for recognizing it. So for a person who can understand and speak that language, that would activate their left hemisphere kind of motor representations a lot more strongly than somebody who didn't be able to speak that in their language. So there's something about whether or not these speech sounds are in your repertoire as to what extent you have a left lateralized system for this. So one idea behind speech perception is that speech as opposed to other sounds only becomes left lateralized when they're part of your language. If they're just auditory sounds, then they are not part of the left lateralized system. They will still be in there, but they will show a more kind of bilateral pattern. They won't activate your motor cortex. So when you're listening to that, that is not activating your motor cortex, it's just activating your auditory cortex. Whereas if you can speak like that, well up here, let me try and put it back into the slide.
Ơi đã út bụi cha út phô bồn đốn ngủ sổ đuôi cô.
Okay, there we go. So one idea is that this how root is involved in certain aspects of speech perception. So as I mentioned, that it will only be activated if you have those phonemes in your language. The idea is that this is one aspect of mirror neurons. So mirror neurons are neurons that fire both when you do something and when you see somebody else doing the same thing. So they were discovered in monkeys. If you see a monkey pick something up, and you pick something up, then your mirror neuron would fire. So mirror neuron fires if you do something and somebody else does the same thing. So they were discovered for actions, but actually they happen also for lip movements and sounds and so on. So one idea is that that these neurons are important for speech perception. It enables us to link the sounds we hear with the kind of motor things that would have produced the sounds in the first place, and that might help us to hear them. The evidence that actually this region helps you to perceive speech is actually quite weak. So if you damage your this how root, you can still hear speech and you can still understand it. So other people have argued that actually this has quite a limited role in understanding speech. But actually it does, it's not that damage to this region has no effect, it does have an effect, it's just quite subtle. And one claim is that it helps speakers to disambiguate speech when it's not entirely clear whether they've said one thing or another. That the motor system would be like I suppose a bit like a judge or a referee in terms of saying that was the syllable or that was not the syllable. Whereas most of the time your what stream, the temporal lobes, is quite capable of doing this without any help from these systems. And that's also seems to be the evidence if you apply TMS over there, that basically if a speech stream is degraded or ambiguous, then this how root seems to be particularly helpful in kind of helping to make the difference in terms of recognizing it. But if a speech is perfectly audible, then you don't need this particular root in order to do it. So there is evidence that these kind of motor representations can help you to hear, but they're not the main way in which you perceive speech, that is for sure. The how root is also sensitive to vision, and this is the classic example of the McGurk illusion, where basically if you've got one person who is saying gar with their lips, but they are you're hearing bar. So basically this is an edited movie in which the lips and the audio are out of sync or incongruent with each other. And one is you're hearing bar and you're seeing gar. Here, what you tend to do is hear something that is completely different from the others. And the idea behind this is that this is, again, linking together auditory information with visual and to some extent motor information, partly because you're looking at the movement of the lips here, that is a kind of visuo-motor signal, and that's helping to disambiguate what it is that you're hearing. So the McGurk illusion isn't arising in your auditory cortex, it's arising by linking auditory information with this more kind of visual kind of a motor route that goes via your parietal lobes into your frontal lobes, in effect. That's the basis for this. Okay, so that's where we've left it so far. So basically the auditory system has multiple different specializations that come from it, despite having this common core within the primary auditory cortex. And we've talked about that in terms of different aspects of music and in terms of different aspects of speech.